There's a specific kind of silence that happens right before your life breaks open. Not loud, not dramatic, just this hollow, almost polite quiet, like the world is holding its breath before it tells you something it's been keeping for a long, long time. I know that silence now. I know exactly what it sounds like. And if I'm being honest with you, I would give almost anything to forget it. But I can't, and I think part of me doesn't want to. Because that silence, that one terrible, still moment, it's also the moment I finally started becoming who I actually am. This is the story of the night everything changed. Not just for me, for my family, for a teacher I trusted more than almost anyone, for relationships I thought were unbreakable, and for a version of myself I had to leave behind in order to survive what came after. I want to tell you this slowly, the way it actually happened, because if I rush it, it won't make sense. And if I tell it out of order, you'll miss the parts that mattered most, the small, quiet, ordinary days that made the fall so much harder to walk away from. So bear with me, we're going back to the beginning. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, not small enough to be charming, not big enough to offer escape. The kind of place where everybody knows your family's name, and that fact is both a comfort and a trap depending on the day. My parents, my mom, Carol, and my dad, Dennis, they weren't wealthy, not even close. My dad worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant. My mom did bookkeeping part-time for a local dentist. We weren't poor, but we lived in the careful, quiet way that people do when they're always just one bad month away from something scary. Our house was a 3-bedroom ranch style on Ellison Street, blue shutters, a front yard my dad mowed every Saturday in straight obsessive lines, a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and whatever my mom was slow cooking. I can close my eyes right now and smell that kitchen. Onions and garlic and something warm. I can hear the refrigerator hum. We weren't a perfect family. My dad didn't say I love you easily. He said it through showing up, through being in the driveway when I got home, through checking my homework without being asked, through working overtime in the winters so the heating bill didn't make my mom go quiet. He was the kind of man who carried everything without telling anyone how heavy it was. My mom was different. She talked. She laughed loud. She cried at commercials and then pretended she hadn't. She had this habit of touching your shoulder when she told you something important, like the words needed physical contact to land properly. She called me Bud, just Bud, not Buddy, just Bud. I didn't realize until I was older how much I needed to hear that word. I was 14 when everything I'm about to tell you started. Old enough to understand more than the adults around me assumed. Young enough to still believe that the grown-ups in my life had it figured out. I had a teacher that year, Mr. Calloway, Raymond Calloway. He taught 8th grade English, and he was the kind of teacher that students talked about for years after they left his classroom. He had this way of reading aloud that made you forget where you were. He'd stand at the front of the room and his voice would drop down low and slow, and even the kids who never paid attention would go still. He also had a phrase he said constantly. Every single class at some point he'd stop whatever we were doing and say, "Tell me the true thing." That was it. Tell me the true thing. It meant stop performing, stop writing what you think I want to hear, tell me what you actually think, what you actually feel. It was his whole philosophy. He said literature was just people trying to tell the true thing because they couldn't say it out loud any other way. I loved that idea. I was 14 and I loved it with my whole heart. There was also a family in our neighborhood that we'd known for years, the Hargrove family. Marcus and Diane Hargrove and their 2 kids, Connor and Lily. They lived 4 streets over in a house that was significantly larger than ours, with a 2-car garage and a sprinkler system that ran at 6 a.m. every morning. Marcus Hargrove owned 2 car dealerships. He drove a silver Audi and wore a watch that cost more than my dad made in 3 months. We weren't exactly friends with the Hargroves, but we weren't not friends either. It was the kind of relationship that's just always existed because of proximity and years. You wave from driveways, you end up at the same school events, you exchange pleasantries at the 4th of July block party. Connor Hargrove was in my grade. He was the kind of kid who wasn't cruel but wasn't kind either. He existed in the comfortable center of everything, popular enough not to be targeted, wealthy enough not to worry, handsome enough for the social machinery to just run smoothly for him at all times. We weren't CLOs, but we weren't enemies. He was just there, like furniture in a room you walk through every day without really seeing. And then there was Mr. Harlow. Gerald Harlow. He lived 3 houses down from us on Ellison Street, old house, peeling paint on the window frames, a chain link fence around a backyard with a garden that somehow produced perfect tomatoes every summer. He was retired, had been a school custodian for 31 years before his knees gave out, lived alone since his wife passed, drove a truck that was held together mostly by rust and stubbornness. My dad used to wave at Mr. Harlow from the mower. Sometimes they'd stand at the fence for 10 or 15 minutes just talking. Nothing important, my dad always said, just talking. I remember thinking Mr. Harlow had sad eyes, not tragic sad, just the kind of sad that settles into a person when they've outlived a lot of what they loved. That fall, the fall I was 14, my mom started acting a little different, just slightly. The kind of slightly that you notice and then forget about because nothing dramatic has happened to call attention to it. She started being on her phone more, not in an obvious way, but I'd come downstairs for water at 10 at night and she'd be sitting at the kitchen table with her phone face down and she'd look up too quickly. She'd smile too immediately, and I'd think nothing. I'd think absolutely nothing because at 14, when your mom smiles at you, you smile back and pour your water and go to bed. My dad was working longer hours. There'd been some kind of production issue at the plant, and they needed maintenance crews available past normal shift end. He'd come home tired in a way that was different from regular tired. There were nights he fell asleep in the chair before dinner was even on the table. I noticed my mom watching him sometimes, just watching him with this expression I couldn't read. Not angry, not sad exactly, something more complicated than both. I told myself it was nothing. Adults got stressed. Money was always a quiet pressure in our house. Everything was fine. Everything was perfectly normal. And it was mostly. We still had Friday movie nights. My mom still made her chili on the first cold weekend of every fall. My dad still checked my homework. Mr. Calloway still made us tell the true thing every Tuesday and Thursday in 4th period. Connor Hargrove still breezed through his life like the world had been arranged for his convenience. Mr. Harlow still tended his tomatoes. Normal, all of it completely normal. Except, and I only know this now, looking back, normal had started lying to me. It was October when I first heard my parents disagree in a way that felt different. not a fight. My parents didn't really fight, but I was walking past the kitchen and I heard my mom say something in a low, careful voice that ended with "you should have told me." And my dad said something even lower that I couldn't catch. And then silence. That kind of silence where you know both people in the room are still talking, just not with words. I kept walking. I went to my room. I put my headphones on. 2 weeks later, I stayed late after school to talk to Mr. Calloway about a short story I'd been working on. It was a story about a boy who finds a key and doesn't know what it opens. He had this way of listening to you that made you feel like what you were saying mattered more than anything else happening in the world at that moment. He'd lean back in his chair and look at the ceiling for a second, then look directly at you and say something that cracked the thing you were trying to figure out wide open. That afternoon, he read my story carefully, all 6 pages of it, and then he put it down and said, "You're writing around the real story. What's the true thing here?" I didn't know what to say. I said I didn't know what he meant. He just nodded like that was the answer he expected. Then he said, "That's okay. Sometimes we don't know what we're actually trying to say until we write it 3 more times." I went home and didn't think about it much, but something about that "you're writing around the real story" stayed with me, sat in the back of my mind like a stone that hadn't settled yet. November came, the days got shorter and colder. My dad started getting home even later. My mom bought a new coat, nothing expensive, just a regular winter coat, and when my dad asked about it, she said she'd gotten it on clearance at Kohl's. He nodded and didn't ask anything else. It's strange, the details you remember. Years later, and I can still see that coat, dark green, buttons down the front, hanging by the door. I walked past it 100 times. I thought nothing of it. One Thursday in mid-November, I was at the library working on a history project when I ran into Mr. Harlow. He was returning books. He was a big reader. I didn't know that, and we ended up sitting at the same table for a while just because there weren't many seats. We talked a little. He asked how school was going. I asked if his tomatoes were done for the season. Then he said something that I didn't understand at the time. He said, "You're a good kid. You've got your dad's eyes, his way of really seeing things." He paused. "Hold on to that." I said thank you. I thought he was just being nice. I think about that conversation more than I probably should. The night it happened was a Thursday in late November, 5 days before Thanksgiving. My mom had said she was going to a book club meeting. She'd started the book club a couple months back, or said she had. A group of women from church getting together on Thursday evenings, she said. She'd mention it casually on Thursdays while she was getting ready. I'd barely registered it. My dad would come home. She'd be gone. He'd heat up whatever she left for him. We'd eat. I'd do homework. That Thursday, my dad came home early. I remember being surprised. He was home before 6, which hadn't happened in weeks. He looked lighter somehow. He'd brought pizza. He was in a good mood in the quiet, careful way he had good moods, a slight softness around his eyes, a willingness to talk about nothing. We ate at the kitchen table together, just the 2 of us. He asked about school. I told him about the English project. We were doing comparative analysis of 2 short stories. He nodded like he was actually following it. He told me about a kid he'd worked with at the plant, young guy, 23 years old, who just had his first baby. He said, "Made me think about when you were born. You came out with your eyes open. Most babies have their eyes closed, not you." I didn't know what to say to that. I just kind of smiled. We washed the dishes together. He dried. I put things away. We didn't talk much, but it was the comfortable kind of not talking, the kind that feels full instead of empty. At around 8:30, he said he was going to step outside for some air. He did that sometimes, stood on the front porch for a few minutes, especially after a hard week. I went back to my history project. He was back inside in less than 5 minutes, and everything was different. I know that sentence sounds like something out of a movie, but I need you to understand this is not an exaggeration. He came back through that front door a completely different person. His face had gone gray, not pale gray. He was holding his phone loosely at his side, and he stood in the hallway for a moment just looking at nothing. I said, "Dad, you okay?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said very quietly, "Go to your room, bud." He called me buds. That was my mom's word for me. He'd never called me that. I went to my room. I sat on my bed. I listened. The front door opened again about 20 minutes later. I heard my mom's voice, higher than usual, tight, like something had been pulled too hard. I heard my dad's voice, lower, steady, but with something underneath it that I'd never heard before. Something that scared me more than shouting would have. I crept to the top of the stairs. I know I shouldn't have. I know that what I heard was not meant for me. But I was 14 and the air in my house had changed, and my brain was doing what brains do when they're scared. It was gathering information, trying to build a story that made sense. I couldn't hear every word. Walls do that. They muffle the specifics but let through the shape of things. And the shape of what I heard was terrible. I heard my mom say she was sorry. I heard that clearly. I heard my dad say a name I recognized, a name that didn't belong in that conversation. Mr. Calloway. Raymond Calloway, my English teacher, the man who told us to tell the true thing. I sat down on the top stair. I sat down because my legs stopped working. I don't know how long I was there. Long enough for the voices to get quieter. Long enough for what I was understanding to fully arrive. My mom and Mr. Calloway. Not a book club, not church friends. All those Thursday evenings, that coat. The phone face down on the kitchen table. The look I couldn't read on her face when she watched my dad come home exhausted and good and completely unaware. I am still not able to find the exact words for what I felt in that moment. I've tried 100 times. The closest I can get is this: it felt like something had been erased, not destroyed, erased. Like a document that was just there a second ago, all its contents gone, the screen blank, and no way to get any of it back. I went back to my room. I lay on top of my covers in my clothes with the lights off. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I cried. I didn't. Not then. I was too stunned for tears. I just lay there in the dark with my eyes open and thought about every single thing I knew about Mr. Calloway. Every Tuesday and Thursday in 4th period. The way he read aloud. The phrase he said constantly, "Tell me the true thing." He knew things about me from my writing that my parents didn't know. He knew that I was scared of not amounting to anything. He knew I loved stories because they were the only place where things eventually made sense. He knew that I didn't feel like I quite fit anywhere, and he told me once that was a gift, not a flaw, because the people who don't quite fit are the ones who can see the whole room. He knew those things about me, and he had been lying to my family. He had been standing in front of me twice a week, looking me in the eyes, teaching me about honesty and truth and the courage it takes to say the real thing, and he had been walking out of that classroom to call my mother. The rage came slowly, not a flash. A slow, rising heat that started somewhere in my chest and worked its way out to my hands. My hands were shaking. I didn't realize they were shaking until I looked at them. I heard my parents' voices go quiet downstairs, then a door, then nothing. I didn't sleep that night, not even close. At about 2 in the morning, I got up and went to my desk and opened my notebook, the one I used for writing stories. And I didn't write a story, I just wrote. I wrote everything I was feeling as fast as I could without stopping to make it good or organized or even legible. It was ugly. It was scattered. It was the most honest writing I had ever done. And I thought, with a bitterness I'd never felt before in my life, Mr. Calloway would be proud. By morning, something in me had reorganized. Not healed, not even close to healed, but reorganized the way furniture gets moved after an accident, not to make the room beautiful, but to make it livable again. My mom was in the kitchen when I came down. She was standing at the counter holding her coffee with both hands, which was something she did when she was trying to hold herself together. She turned around when she heard me and her face did something complicated, a kind of love and guilt and exhaustion all happening at the same time. She said, "Good morning, bud." And I just looked at her. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman with her coffee and her guilt and her complicated expression. This woman who used to touch my shoulder when she told me something important. This woman who cried at commercials and called me bud and made chili every first cold weekend. I said good morning, I poured my cereal, I sat down. We didn't talk about it, not that morning, not yet. My dad was gone before I woke up. He'd left for work early, or that's what my mom said. I didn't ask anything else. I ate my breakfast, picked up my backpack, and went to school. I walked into Mr. Calloway's class 4th period and sat in my seat. He was at the board when I came in, writing a vocabulary list. He turned around and said good morning to the class. His eyes passed over me in the same way they passed over everyone else. Warm, attentive, professional. I felt sick. I watched him for the whole class. Every gesture, every pause, the way he leaned against his desk when he was thinking, the way he pushed his glasses up, the way he laughed quietly at something a student said. I watched him like I was trying to find the seam, the line where the real person ended and the performance began. I never found it, and somehow that was worse, because it meant the person I'd trusted was fully integrated with the person who had caused this damage. He wasn't a monster in disguise. He was a real, human, complicated man who had done something that was hurting my family, and those two things existed in him simultaneously, without canceling each other out. That's a hard thing to understand when you're 14. Honestly, it's a hard thing to understand at any age. A week passed, the house on Ellison Street became a different kind of place. My dad was home, but not really there. He sat in the chair where he used to fall asleep easily, but now he sat in it awake and somewhere else entirely. My mom moved around the kitchen with extreme care, like everything was fragile. They were not fighting, I want to be clear about that. There were no slammed doors, no screaming. What there was instead was this devastating politeness, please and thank you and can you pass the salt, a civility so careful it was more painful than anger would have been. I talked to exactly no one about it, not my friends at school, not my cousin Jake who was my closest friend outside of school, no one. I carried it around like a stone in my chest and went through my days. One afternoon during that week, I was sitting on the front porch doing homework when Mr. Harlow came by on his usual late afternoon walk. He stopped at the end of our walkway like he sometimes did and we talked for a few minutes. He asked about school. I gave him the short answer. Then he said, and I don't know why he said this, maybe he was just being an old man being thoughtful, or maybe he understood more than I realized, he said, "You know what I've learned in 72 years, the hardest art of any hard time isn't the hard part itself. It's deciding who you want to be on the other side of it." He nodded at me like that was enough and kept walking. I sat there on the porch for a long time after he was gone. My mom and dad had a real conversation about 2 weeks after that night. A long one. I know because I was in the house when it happened, and it lasted for almost 3 hours, and when it was over both of them came out of the bedroom looking emptied out in a way that was also somehow lighter. My mom came to my room that night. She knocked on the door, she never knocked, she always just opened it, and she came in and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at her hands. She said, "I know you know." I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not going to explain it to you in a way that makes it okay because it's not okay. I made a choice that hurt your dad and it hurt our family and I'm going to spend a long time trying to fix that. But I need you to know," her voice started again. "I need you to know that nothing about how much I love you is part of any of this. That's the one thing that has never moved." I looked at her, I thought about all the things I could say. I thought about how angry I was and how scared and how much I missed the way things were 2 weeks ago before I sat on those stairs and heard a name I was never supposed to hear. I said, "I know, Mom." And I meant it, even through everything, I meant it. She put her hand on my shoulder, like she always did when she was telling me something important. I stopped going to Mr. Calloway's class differently after that. I still went, I still did the work, but something in me had gone quiet in that room. I wasn't angry at him in front of other people, I didn't know how to be. But I wasn't the same student I'd been before. The student who raised his hand, who volunteered to read, who stayed after to talk about stories and keys, and the true thing, that kid didn't come back to 4th period. Mr. Calloway noticed, of course he noticed. A couple weeks into December, he asked me to stay after class. The room emptied out, he sat on the edge of his desk. I stood near the door, the distance between us felt correct. He said, "I've noticed you seem somewhere else lately. Is everything all right?" And I looked at him, this man with his warm eyes and his patient voice and his whole philosophy about honesty, and I said, "No, sir, but I don't think there's anything you can help me with." A look crossed his face, just for a second, a kind of recognition, a kind of pain he knew I knew. He said my name, just my name, quietly. I said, "I'm going to miss my bus," and I walked out. I want to tell you about my dad during this period, because I think he's the part of this story that stays with me the most. Dennis Brannick, my father, was not a man who talked about his feelings, not because he didn't have them, but because his whole life he'd been told that carrying your feelings quietly was strength. He'd been raised by a man who never cried, who worked until he couldn't stand up straight, who showed love through discipline and provision and presence. My dad had absorbed all of that. He was his father's son in those ways. But I saw what this did to him in those weeks. I watched my dad, this big, quiet, solid man who mowed the yard in straight lines and checked my homework without being asked, I watched him get smaller, not physically, spiritually somehow. Like something essential was leaking out of him slowly, and he was trying to keep his hands pressed to the wound. He still did everything he was supposed to do. He still went to work. He still came home. He still asked about school. But the lightness that had been in him that Thursday when he'd brought home pizza, the slight softness around the eyes, that was gone. And I understood for the first time that lightness hadn't just been my dad being in a good mood. It had been my dad feeling safe, feeling like his life was his. And now that was gone. I made him coffee one Sunday morning without being asked. Just got up before him, figured out the machine. I'd watched my mom do it 1,000 times and had a cup ready when he came downstairs. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the coffee and then looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just crossed the kitchen and put his hand on the back of my neck the way he sometimes did, firm and brief, and then he poured his coffee and sat down. We read the paper together. He didn't speak much. I didn't either. But it was the fullest morning we'd had in weeks. The holidays came. They were strange, not terrible, not ruined, just strangely muted. Like someone had turned the volume down on everything by about 30%. My mom made her chili. My dad put up the Christmas lights. We opened presents. We called my grandma. But underneath all of it there was this constant awareness, this low hum of something that had been broken and not yet fixed, maybe not fixable, maybe just something we would have to integrate the way you integrate a scar. Marcus Hargrove had the neighborhood over for his annual Christmas party. My parents went, I think because not going would have required an explanation, and they weren't ready for explanations. Connor Hargrove and I stood in the Hargrove living room eating shrimp cocktail and making polite conversation about nothing. His house was warm and large, and every surface had been professionally decorated. His dad was at the center of every room, laughing his big, easy laugh. I remember thinking, I don't know why, that Marcus Hargrove had no idea what was actually happening in the houses around him. He lived in his beautiful house with his sprinkler system and his silver Audi and his 2 dealerships, and he smiled at my parents across the room, completely unaware that the woman holding the glass of wine and the man standing slightly too far away from her were in the middle of the hardest winter of their lives. Wealth doesn't give you vision, I thought. It just gives you a bigger room to be blind in. I'm not sure I could have articulated it that way at 14, but I felt it. In January, something shifted, slowly. The way seasons shift, not a single day, but a gradual accumulation of small changes. My parents started talking again, not about what happened, at least not in front of me, but just talking. About normal things. About the house, about bills, about whether to get a new water heater. The conversation I overheard one night that made me actually exhale for the first time in weeks was about nothing more important than what to do with the bush in the front yard that had died. They were deciding something together. That's what I realized. The act of deciding something together, even something as minor as a dead bush, meant something had been chosen. My dad had chosen to stay, or at least to try. My mom had chosen to be honest and to do the work. And they were, in the most ordinary and unglamorous way possible, trying to put something back together. I don't want to make this sound easy. It wasn't. There were nights I heard tension in the kitchen. There were mornings I came down and the air had that heaviness again. Healing isn't a line that goes upward. It's a mess. 2 steps forward and then a night that takes you sideways and then you find your footing again. But they were trying, and I had not expected that. I had expected the kind of ending I'd seen in movies: doors slamming, boxes being packed, someone driving away. The fact that they were choosing the harder, messier, less cinematic option, the option of staying and repairing, that was something I didn't have a framework for yet. I had to build one. Mr. Calloway left the school at the end of that school year. I found out through the rumor mill teachers talk, students over here. There were no dramatic announcements. One day he was there, and then over the summer he was quietly reassigned to another district. Whether my parents had anything to do with that, I genuinely don't know. They never told me. I never asked. What I do know is that on the last day of 8th grade, I went to his classroom to get a book I'd left in my locker nearby, and he was in there packing up. Boxes on every desk, papers in neat piles. The classroom stripped of the small things that had made it feel like his, the poster of the quote from Hemingway, the stack of books he always had on the corner of the desk, the coffee mug with the cracked handle that he'd had since before I was in his class. He looked up when I came in. We looked at each other for a moment. He said, "I'm sorry." Just that, no explanation, no defense, 2 words. I nodded. I didn't say you're forgiven because I wasn't there yet. I didn't say I hate you because that wasn't entirely true either. I just nodded, picked up the book I'd come for and walked out. I've thought about that moment often. I've thought about what I wish I'd said and what I'm glad I didn't say. And mostly what I come back to is this: he gave me something real even through what he did. He taught me that honesty mattered, that telling the true thing was the only thing worth doing. He taught me that, and then he failed to live it. And weirdly, that contradiction, that a person can teach you something true while lying to you, was one of the most important things I ever learned, because it meant the lesson didn't belong to him. The lesson was bigger than him. The truth is the truth regardless of who says it and regardless of whether they're living it. That took me years to arrive at, but it started in that stripped classroom on the last day of 8th grade. Mr. Harlow died in the spring of that year. Heart attack. Quietly, the way he lived. His daughter came up from Tennessee to take care of the house and the garden. She was there for about 2 weeks. My dad went over and helped her carry boxes. I went with him. We didn't know her, but she was nice, tired, and sad in the way people are when they've lost a parent they weren't ready to lose, even when they were. She found a box in his closet with old letters in it. She showed my dad one of them, not the contents, just the fact of them. She said he kept everything. He was the kind of man who kept everything. My dad nodded. He said, "Good man, just a genuinely good man." I thought about what Mr. Harlow had said to me on that afternoon walk. The hardest part of any hard time isn't the hard part itself. It's deciding who you want to be on the other side of it. I think I understand it now. I think I understand it fully. I'm 34 years old as I tell you this. I live in a different city now, been here for almost 10 years. I've built a life I'm proud of, not because it's perfect, but because it's mine, and because I built it with my eyes open. My parents are still together. 20 years after that night, they are still in the house on Ellison Street with the blue shutters and the mowed yard. They're different now, not the parents I had at 14, but grown into something more honest and more deliberate. There's a tenderness between them that didn't used to be there. The kind of tenderness that only comes from having been through something and choosing each other anyway. My mom still touches my shoulder when she tells me something important. My dad still doesn't say I love you out loud very often, but when I call on Sundays, he picks up on the first ring without exception. That's his I love you. That's always been his I love you. I think about that Thursday night sometimes, the night I sat on the top stair and heard a name I wasn't supposed to hear. I think about how that one moment collapsed the world I had and forced me to build a new one, a more honest one, a more complicated one. And I think about the silence before it all started. That specific hollow, almost polite silence that happened when the world was holding its breath. I don't hate that silence anymore. I understand it now. I understand that it was the sound of something trying to be true. Something that had been living underground for too long in the dark, where it was doing more damage than it ever would have done in the light. The truth is expensive. That's what I've learned. It costs something to tell it, and it costs something to hear it, and sometimes it costs the version of your life that you thought you were going to have. But living without it costs more. Living inside a comfortable lie is like living inside a house that has a crack in the foundation that nobody's talking about. Everything looks fine. The furniture is nice. The kitchen smells good. But underneath, something is giving way, and the longer you don't deal with it, the more expensive the repair becomes. I write things now. Stories mostly. Some for myself, some for other people to read. Every single time I sit down to write, there's a voice in the back of my head, calm mid-tempo, pushing his glasses up, and it says the same thing it always said. Tell me the true thing. I still do every time. I still try. I don't know why I'm telling you all of this. Maybe because I've been carrying it for 20 years and it's lighter when I share it. Maybe because I know someone out there is sitting in a house right now that feels normal on the surface and slightly wrong underneath, and they don't have the words for it yet. Maybe I'm telling it because I want them to know that what comes after the silence isn't the end of the story. It's just where the real story starts. Not the easy story, not the clean one, the true one. And the true one is always worth telling. Even when, especially when, it's the hardest thing you've ever had to say.